So now Cornwallis can't go anywhere because he's got Lafayette on one side, who's keeping him from leaving via land, and he has the French fleet on the other side, which keeps him from leaving via sea. So Cornwallis is stuck. Now, at this point, in early October, Rochambeau and Washington have arrived in Virginia, and they're going to start to lay siege to Cornwallis stuck in the Yorktown area. Now, again, another opportunity for us to say thank you to France, because Washington did not know much about laying siege to anything, because that wasn't the way he was taught how to fight, and which is fine and just dandy. But the French are very good at laying sieges, and if you remember the lecture about the 7 Years' War, the French have actually perfected the art of the siege. They are considered by Europeans to have the best artillery, to have the best siege craft of any country in Europe. Vauban, who was a 17th century Frenchman who worked for Louis XIV, actually came up with the various processes of taking a fortress. And so the French are more than equipped to handle a siege. And in fact, Rochambeau has brought all of the things necessary with him. He has all the appropriate tools, he has all the appropriate weapons, he knows exactly what he's doing. And so many times I've heard Yorktown referred to as Washington's greatest victory. And while Washington did many wonderful things for the American Revolution, which I have not addressed, and while Washington was very important for the American Revolution and showed excellent examples of generalship at other parts of the American Revolution, here, the best thing Washington did was listen to Rochambeau. Because Rochambeau knows how to conduct a proper siege, and his soldiers are trained for it. And really, for the French army to lay siege to Yorktown is, on the scale that the French are used to, not that big. The French have laid siege to fortresses for 3 or 4 years at times. So Yorktown is something that they are more than ready to handle. And just to illustrate how adept the French were at sieges, I've brought a couple pieces to show you. This is a wonderful piece. It's a part of a book called the Art Militaire Fortification. There's a huge series on art militaire, military arts, military necessities, and this is the part of the fortification piece. During the Enlightenment, there was a wonderful man named Diderot who wrote an encyclopédie. It's kind of the first encyclopedia, and it wasn't just an encyclopedia that we would think of today like Wikipedia, which had entries on countries and animals and things like that. Diderot was also interested in trades. How did people make baskets? What did silversmiths do? How did certain things work? So he also looked at how certain things worked and how certain trades operated. And this included, of course, the French army. So he has a wonderful collection that we have here at the Society of Cincinnati that shows all of the materials necessary for laying a siege. And so I show this to you as just an interesting example for the tools that were necessary and that the French are very good at using. And you can see things that I've mentioned before about laying sieges, such as the baskets, such as the sticks that were put together that would help absorb any kind of cannon fire that were aimed at trenches that the French were digging to get closer and closer to their fortification. And you can see elsewhere in this wonderful picture, see if I can find it. They have examples of what the trenches looked like as they were digging them, and here it is. What the trenches looked like as they were digging them. Because remember I said there are trenches, and they continue to dig trenches closer and closer and closer to the fortress, and that allows them to move their guns closer and closer and closer to the fortress that they're laying siege to. And here you can kind of see kind of the wonky way those trenches work, so that they never have just one straight line going forward, because that would be too easy for the fortress to destroy with their guns. But it's kind of slowly creeping closer and closer to that fortress. And of course, these are sieges on a massive scale. So taking Yorktown is going to be very doable for the French. And again, to illustrate how good the French are at sieges, I have another wonderful piece to show you. This is called Le Jeu de la Guerre, or the war game. It is literally a board game. It's a wonderful board game. It was made in 1750 for a French noble officer. And you start down here at the first square here, and you move your piece kind of in this pattern around the edges, and then you move closer and closer in until this is the final square where the French officer who has performed very well in battle gets an award from the king. And so this kind of illustrates, and it has all the different, each square is a different situation that French officers would have to face if they were at war. And there's one in particular I'd like to bring to your attention, and it's this one. It's number 36. It's the siege. And if you happen to land on this square, the siege, you would have to give up so many of your little tokens, and you would have to wait 6 turns before you got to go again, because sieges took a long time. But once you had waited your 6 turns and other people had had a chance to move elsewhere around the board, you would get to skip all the way up to here, which is square number 49, which is very close to your goal of getting a medal from the king. And this is kind of emblematic of how sieges worked for the French, because if they were going to lay siege to something, it took a long time and it was expensive, but they almost always won. It was all but, unless the other fortress was particularly well armed and had a way to get supplies to it, and your forces were particularly ill prepared to lay siege to that fortress, you should be able to take it. And so this again is just another illustration of how ready the French were to lay siege to something, and how accustomed they were to it. So the French begin to lay siege at Yorktown, and after that, in pretty quick succession, they're able to take Yorktown. And I'll just point out a few key dates here. On October 6th, the French started digging trenches, which is the first step. And of course, digging trenches is a dangerous job. You could be blown up to smithereens if a cannonball hits you, but they got their trenches started. On October 10th, they had enough guns in place that they could start shelling Yorktown. So it only took them about 4 days to bring in the big guns. On October 12th, they had shelled the fortress enough to the point where they felt comfortable advancing their trenches even closer to the fortress at Yorktown, closer to the British at Yorktown. And so they start shelling again. On October 14th, there's a very important battle at 8 o'clock at night, in which a very elite group of French soldiers who are light troops and who are used to fighting in very close quarters are sent under the command of Viomnel to go and take redoubts 9 and 10. And these are just outlying posts that the British have that are going to try to stop the French advance. And they are joined by Lafayette and his American troops. And the two of them fight together, they combine their forces, and this is one of the very few times where you see the French and the Americans actually fighting alongside each other. They fight together, and the French sustain about 25% casualties, the Americans sustain about the same, but the British sustain about a third of their troops' casualties at redoubts 9 and 10. And so the French are able to take that, and they get even closer to Cornwallis. Let's see, and then on the 16th of October, the British perform a counterattack, so they send some of their troops out to try to take out as many guns as possible, because if the French army doesn't have guns anymore, large artillery pieces anymore that they can use to batter Yorktown, then they're going to have to retreat and go get more guns, and maybe Cornwallis will have a chance to escape. Unfortunately, unfortunately for Cornwallis, the counterattack doesn't work very, very well, and the British are able to spike about 4 guns, but then the French army is able to chase them off again. And so then, on the 17th, now that his resources are fairly exhausted, Cornwallis is going to ask for surrender terms. And Cornwallis, as legend has it, was too sick at the time to go and actually surrender himself to George Washington, but he puts forth his surrender terms. He's got about 2 hours to get them together. He submits them, and essentially he's going to have to surrender all of his troops. He's going to have to surrender with his flags sheathed, so he can't be flying his colors when he surrenders, and that's kind of an insult to the British, but the British made the Americans surrender in the same way, so George Washington is going to say, okay, an eye for an eye, you have to sheathe your colors too. And when Cornwallis sends his second-in-command to go surrender Cornwallis's sword, the second-in-command looks around, who do I give this to? And of course he marches right up to Rochambeau, who is of course the man who arranged the siege. And Rochambeau, because he is subordinate to General Washington, turns it over to Washington, and Washington, who refuses to accept it, allows General Lincoln to accept it on his behalf. And hooray, Yorktown has surrendered.